Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's program. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ayan Jama. I am the acting manager for Diversity Inclusion Department here at the University Student Union at CSUN. Thank you for joining us for the first part of Examining Our Campus series. This is a three-part series consisting of today's program and two more coming up exciting programs. And in this three-part series, we'll take the opportunity to have essential conversations while looking at our campus culture as well as historical evidence that prevents eradication of racism in our systems. Today's program, titled Challenging Microaggressions and Implicit Biases in and out of side of the classroom, is led by esteemed scholar and activist Dr. Charles Davis III. And if you don't know him, he's a force to reckon with. Our next two programs our next two programs titled, first one titled, What Are Modern Day Fuels of Racism, features Angela Davis, civil rights activist, and part two, still pending, and once we, finalize everything, which, we're almost there, and if all confirmed, will be featured Dr. Abram Kindi. And this one is titled Becoming an Anti-Racist Advocate. So we're so excited to all of these programs lineups that we have for you. This is part of our Essential Talks Anti-Racism Learning Network series. So we're so excited that you're joining us and to continue having these conversations. As always, before we continue and before we dive deep into our program today, we must do land acknowledgement. We need to do a land acknowledgement to really continue to acknowledge the land our campus occupies. And to do that, I'm going to first welcome our student assistant, Kayleen Zapeta, to kindly do our land acknowledgement for today.
Hello, everyone. So we want to start today's program by respecting and acknowledging the land in which we currently reside. We know land acknowledgements are used by Native people and non-natives to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land on which we now live. California State University Northridge recognizes and acknowledges the Sisavitam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Sisavanga that is now occupied by our institution. And it honors their elders, past and present, and the Sisavitam descendants who are citizens of the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that the Sisavitam are still here, and we are committed to uplifting their stories, culture, and community. We have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University Northridge accountable to the needs of the American Indian peoples in this region. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kayleen, for doing the land acknowledgement for us. So just a couple of housekeeping items. You have access to the chat. Please interact with each other, interact with us. We will have a Q&A portion of this program, so you'll be able to post questions. During the Q&A session, you can also raise your hand. So multiple ways that we can make sure that we answer questions. So make sure that you let us know if you need the closed captioning, feel free to turn on. If you have any specific questions, whatever it may be, please, you can reach out to us in the chat or privately message myself or Dwayne Johnson. That said, I am going to now hand it over to Dwayne Johnson to introduce himself as well as introduce our speaker today.
Yes, thank you, Ayan. Hello, everyone. Like Ayan mentioned, my name is Dwayne Johnson, and I am the Diversity Initiative Supervisor here at the University Student Union. So we look forward into delving into today's topic of microaggressions and implicit biases. It is essential that we have conversations such as these because it motivates institutions to change perspective around anti-racism work and while creating a sense of belonging for otherwise marginalized students. So with that being said, our speaker today is no stranger to that. I would like to introduce our speaker for today's event, Dr. Charles Davis III. Dr. Charles H.F. Davis III is a third-generation educator and creative committed to the lives, love, and liberation of everyday Black people. He currently serves as an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan, where his research and teaching broadly focus on the issues of race, racism, and the resistance in education and society. He has produced more than 36 publications, including research articles, books, and scholarly essays, as well as several short and feature-length films. His work have been featured in, but not limited to, the Los Angeles Times, Bloomberg News, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and cited in amicus briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 2020, Dr. Davis was recognized as an emerging scholar by the Diverse Issues in Higher Education and is a recipient of the 2021 National Academy of Education or Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. As a racial equity educator, Dr. Davis has trained more than 7,000 students, educators, and institutional leaders from over 100 colleges and universities in the United States and abroad. As an organizer, Dr. Davis is the founder and director for the Scholars for Black Lives Collective, an international group of grassroots and university thinkers who are politically committed to the labor of engaged scholarship, public teaching, and advocacy against injustice to the end of improving the material conditions for everyday Black people. Welcome, Dr. Davis.
Brother Dwayne, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You read it exactly as I wrote it, so I'll be sure to put your check in the mail as soon as we finish up here today. CSUN, how we doing? It's really great to see you all virtually, although it's been some time since I've actually had the pleasure of being on campus, which I think was a few years ago at this point, but really excited to be here with you to engage in today's conversation and to contribute to the wide level of professional learning and organizational development that's been taking place over the last year. You've already heard a bit about myself with regard to the typical bio that you hear from many scholars, one that's full of the things that we've done and the places that we've been. But I think it's so important to think about that with regard to my own journey, right? What does it mean to be a human being beyond all of the things that we say and the things that we share about ourselves? And so when I think about that, I think it's important for us to tell our stories. And so what is my story? Well, mine is the story of a boy who spent his childhood summers becoming Black in Alabama, wrestling dirt in the whispering winds of Wetumpka out back of a one-room shack in which his great-grandmother raised 15 children. Mine is the story of a boy who spent time with an old man, fishing the broken bakes of Birmingham and riding a tractor in the tattered town of Tuskegee, only to learn years later that the old man indeed was not his grandfather. It is also the story of a school teacher's son and an Army colonel's firstborn, one who as a child was taught that being Black in an anti-Black world demanded he work twice as hard simply to get half as far. And so it is with this set of sensibilities, my being and becoming a university professor, guaranteed to bring the mo, not the lesser, makes the unprofitable inevitable. Greetings, salutations, and all power to the people. Again, my name is Charles Davis, and I'm a curly-headed Black boy by way of the Global South. And today I stand before you as an educator committed to the lives, love, liberation, memories, and imaginations of everyday Black people. I come to you as part and parcel of my local political home, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, an organization that is fundamentally committed to building deep and powerful movements on behalf of the local people in Los Angeles County, ultimately to improving their material conditions. As a point of proper protocol and privilege, I would first ask that you join me again in a moment to acknowledge the land upon which I find myself, land that was stolen through the genocide and forcible removal of Indigenous peoples, including but not limited to the Potawatomi, Ottawa, Ojibwa, Miami, and Huron tribes of Michigan. Land that was also toiled by the blood, sweat, and tears of stolen labor through enslaved Africans to drive the economic engine of the South as well as that of the nation. Also through the exploitation of Chinese railroad workers for the westward expansion, an area that now, as you know, as Californians, is protected from fire for less than $1 a day by formerly and currently incarcerated people. Now, I would be, of course, remiss if I didn't extend a deep sense of gratitude and a thank you to, again, Brother Dwayne Johnson, Ayan Jama, Kayleen Cepeda, and other members of the University Student Union Diversity and Inclusion team for their efforts specifically to make my being here possible. Given the current socio-political climate related to telling the truth and a nation committed to the lies that serve as the bedrock of our individual and collective suffering, I do not take for granted an opportunity to address any audience beyond those who are perhaps encouraged to enroll in my classes. I know that it is only through the work of committed and courageous folks that I am here, and for committed and courageous folks like yourselves to serve as an audience. And for that, I am very, very thankful. Now, as a faculty member here at the University of Michigan, as was mentioned before, I broadly focus on issues of race and racism, systems of oppression, and organized resistance in education and its social context. However, my work is specifically focused on understanding the ways that new and digital media are used by student activists as a part of a dynamic, interactive process of cultural production and organizing strategies and tactics. Now, historically, student activism has been the miner's canary for identifying and addressing many of the intractable problems plaguing both school and society. Now, whether we consider the Butter Rebellion of 1766 at Harvard protesting food quality, the abolitionist students of Lane Seminary in the 1830s organizing against the institution of slavery, or student socialists, anti-fascists, and communists in the 1930s, all have played an integral part in post-secondary and US history. Additionally, as Marthia Bondi and Ibram X. Kendi, who you will hear from later this year, their work makes clear that Black student activists in the mid-20th century revolutionized and radically reconstituted US higher education during the 1960s toward a more representative campus and curriculum. But still today, as has been the case for many generations of student activists, many of the grievances at the center of student demands have remained relatively constant. So in the period between 2014 and 2018, Black and other minoritized students from nearly 100 colleges and universities issued demands for their institutions. Many of those demands explicitly drew upon what movement scholars describe as communities of memory and history as a moral resource. Particularly issues around curricular disregard across fields and disciplines beyond race and gender-based epistemologies, diverse representation in students, faculty, and administrators, funding for under-resourced student services, and issues of campus safety, including police, have all been consistent grievances. This fact, while misconstrued as evidence against the power of protest, says more about the endemic and enduring nature of systemic oppression and disenfranchisement from equitable educational opportunity, and why student activism has neither been a marathon nor a sprint, but instead a relay across generations of those committed to the causes of freedom and liberation. As the founding director of the Campus Abolition Research Lab and principal investigator of the Police Free Campus Project, our work is broadly examining the ways that higher education institutions and its agents, through settler and racial colonial policies and practices, create the conditions that necessitate policing. Grounded in the experiences of communities most vulnerable to state and state-sanctioned violence, it is our position that policing is about more than police. Specifically, we believe policing to be a set of relationships and practices empowered by the state and its institutions to enact surveillance, social control, domination, and punishment through the present threat and use of force. And while today's program intends to focus on understanding and challenging implicit bias and microaggressions in the context of college and university life, I find it important that we also consider all the ways the post-secondary context, as well as our teaching and learning, demonstrate practices of surveillance, control, domination, and punishment. After all, the racial and otherwise minoritizing experiences of students made vulnerable and rendered to the margins of our institutions are the consequences of these very practices, some of which are irreparable and lifelong. Now, since its inception, higher education has functioned as an important resource in the production and maintenance of a white dominant class, as well as for the advancement of their interests. This includes its privileging, perpetuation, and normalization of white ways of being, seeing, doing, and knowing. From its earliest presence in the form of what we now call the colonial colleges, history teaches us that many colleges, as well as their founders, leaders, trustees, faculty, and even students owned and directly profited from the stolen labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. While this particular historical fact suggests both a limited collective of beneficiaries as well as a limited temporality of slavery as a compartment of the times, it is more accurate to understand how all higher education institutions in the United States demanded both the theft of land and labor as a precondition for the rise of American colleges and universities. As Craig Wilder notes in his seminal text, Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of American Universities, U.S. higher education exploited Native and Black people for the benefit of a white, predominantly male Christian ruling class. Now, this was specifically through the violent theft and dispossession of the very lands we acknowledged at the beginning of this program, whether unceded or forced into relinquished through the fraudulent treaties. Further, substantive funding for institutions was also directly linked to the evangelistic efforts for pacifying local indigenous communities through practices of colonial genocide. Now, in conjunction, early colleges used enslaved people and stolen labor to clear land and construct buildings for the maintenance of presidents' homes and campus buildings, to wait on faculty and students, to work the campus kitchens, and even for the entertainment of students. In fact, many of the families involved in the founding, funding, and presiding over these institutions themselves were slave owners, some of whom even underwrote the entire chattel slavery enterprise. And it were these families that colleges sought to secure patronage through also tuition and institutional benefaction of student enrollments and their families. Wilder would conclude his text by saying, it was the security that human slavery provided free men, the wealth that slave traders and slaveholders could generate, and the social networks of plantation economies that carried the American Academy into modernity. Thus, the framework from which post-secondary enterprise has continued to work has remained undergirded by an appeal, perhaps even an obligation to the preservation of institutions that ultimately serve to preserve the racial status quo. Now, the aforementioned historical legacies of racial colonial violence really laid the predicate for enduring social and political force of white supremacy in contemporary higher education. When we consider how marginalized people have and continue to exist in an entanglement with the formal systems of schooling, including colleges and universities, or what Mustafa has broadly referred to as educational violence, we are able to remove the veil from progressive notions and the beliefs that higher education itself is a solution rather than the reality that it is also part of the problem. We find this to be true in the evidence from decades of work on campus racial climate, of which the historical legacies of land theft, dispossession, and genocide play a critical part. What is more, the vestiges of a more overt period of racial violence remain with us in the ways that students experience presumptions about their belongingness as well as their personhood, which brings me back to my point about policing as a set of relationships and practices. Now, what it often informs these dispositions as figures of authority on college and university campuses is our deputization to determine and create the conditions of belongingness and deservingness at the center of our teaching and student affairs practice. It is these notions of belonging and deserving which are deep core beliefs in higher education policy and practice. They are deeply connected to the various implicit biases that inform our actions, albeit unconsciously. Now, whether it is the presumption that a Latina student must have plagiarized her paper simply because we have not yet familiarized ourselves with the contributions and narratives about Latinx women in scholarly discourse, or that of Black students who are only considered students if and when they can produce the proper identification, proving that they too are matadors. That these preconceived notions of who a college student is and what they are capable of are all informed by our bias towards a version of college going and college success that affords only some the good love, healthy choices, and second chances we all deserve. And one of the consequences of these biases, as we all know very well, are the microaggressions that students, staff, and faculty of various marginalized and minoritized groups experience. As Munoz and colleagues have posited, at the structural level, racial microaggressions are transmitted through symbols, social practices, social codes for behavior, physical symbols, and images. Collectively, these racially prejudiced actions, words, symbols, and behaviors work to normalize the everyday ordinariness of racism. And so this normalization and everydayness to which Munoz is referring is perhaps even more consequential when we consider the commonplace attacks aimed at race-based epistemologies by the political right, as well as those who sympathize in our institutions with the notion that acknowledging and confronting issues of race and racism is the real problem in American education. And while such challenges is not only an affront to academic freedom, we cannot be outraged merely by this overt gesture when innumerable actions within and beyond college and university classrooms routinely challenge racially minoritized scholars and those students as producers of knowledge from perspectives and experiences that themselves challenge white supremacy as both an ideology and an embodied practice. And so as we're considering these important themes, these important ideas, these important notions within the context of our teaching and learning, we must also consider the ways in which we ourselves often function as police. In what ways do we think about the students that are in our classrooms, the students that roam around campus, even our very colleagues of the places in which they occupy? What is it to question Black and brown faculty of their presence on a college university campus when they are often treated simply as the help? What does it mean to ascribe dignity to all labor, regardless of position, as contributors to a community that says we want this to be a safe place in which students can live, work, and learn? And so as we transition a bit to our latter part of our conversation, a workshop that engages with some of these questions, I want us to be thinking and reflecting in this particular moment of how we take up space, how we make space for the things that we say that we value, how our values are often incongruent with our very actions. For us to be educators, we have to think about what it means to be making possible the places and spaces in which education can happen. As we know all too well, every space itself can function as a classroom, and every moment can itself be teachable. But who are we allowing in? Who are we allowing to speak? And who are we allowing to feel safe? I want to thank you for this particular moment to address you briefly. I hope that in our conversation, we will engage in some question asking and perhaps some answers, but more importantly, raising the ideas and thinking about these in complex ways. We know that these things are not at all simple, and that in fact, in order for us to be able to move forward, we have to name the things that do us harm, right? We have to empower those who have otherwise been disempowered by the education that we have provided, and create and hold the space necessary to ensure that liberation and freedom is possible for us all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for those thoughtful points and really kind of highlighting important history and really kind of giving us that reminder. So now we're going to, go to the, the workshop session of the program. So we'll turn it back to you to lead us on the workshop session.
All right, great. All right, can we see the slides okay? Just a thumbs up would be good. All right, and we see the master slide, correct? Not the presenter notes. All right, always a trick. I think after 2 years of virtual teaching, we should figure out how to do that, right?
Yeah, I think we see the presenter notes.
Oh, you actually see the presenter slide. Okay, so let's do it this way.
There we go.
Switched out, we're good? All right, there we go. Thank you for the teamwork. All right, so to get us started, so we are going to be going through a series of definitions as well as questions. And so part of this is to ensure that we have a shared understanding of what we mean when we say things like microaggressions or implicit bias, given that some of us may have some familiarity, others, this may be relatively new. And so I want to start with implicit bias. Now, if we had a few less people, we could do a bit more call and response. I'm not in the church, but of the church to a certain degree, and that might be helpful. But for the sake of time, we'll try to preserve some of that for some breakout conversation to, again, sort of engage around these questions. So thinking about implicit bias, this is a term that we hear a lot about and have heard a lot about in recent years. And of course, this is a contested term, right? Whether this is the right term to actually ascribe to the things that we experience on our college and university campuses that actually have very specific meanings and very specific outcomes. When we're looking at trying to define implicit bias, well, a couple of things come to mind. That first, we think about it as a reference to these mental associations that arise out of the or subconscious, often informed by and perpetuated by myths and stereotypes, which inform our understanding, actions, and decision-making. Now, a critical juncture of understanding implicit bias is that everyone, all of us, regardless of our social identity category or marginalized status, is susceptible to these implicit biases. But of course, based on that social position, these implicit biases have very different ramifications. Right. And so when we're thinking about those implicit biases, we have to be thoughtful to know that even those who perceive themselves to be objective or impartial in their judgment also succumb to having biases be a part of their decision-making process. I think this is critically important for those of us engaging in teaching and learning as instructors in the ways we think that perhaps we evaluate students objectively, right? Also how the ways we read and engage scholarship, but also, again, how we perceive and engage with the campus environment. Implicit biases are also involuntarily activated and function outside of our general consciousness or control. Turning to the work of Cheryl Stotts and understanding implicit bias work coming out of the Kirwan Institute, they write that because the implicit associations we hold arise out of conscious awareness, outside of conscious awareness, implicit biases do not necessarily align with our explicit beliefs or stated intentions. And so why is this important? Well, when we think about this particular socio-political moment, all the ways in which our institutions, as well as individual faculty and leaders of departments and colleges and schools, are doing what I would suggest are rhetorical moves to innocence. That is, we're often espousing these values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and yet our practice and our policy are not meeting those espoused values, right? That we often suggest through our words and various statements that are posted after George Floyd, after the horrific anti-Asian racial violence in Atlanta, that we care about the well-being of those who are a part of those particular groups. And yet we do very little to assure that our systems, our processes, and our procedures allow for a proper greater diversification of those representations on campus, as well as the ways of seeing, being, and knowing that fall outside of what we consider to be appropriate for a college university context to take up space. So to think more explicitly about implicit bias, we know that this is about cognitive function. So a lot of this work emerges out of psychology, and there are 5 particular ways, six specific ways, I should have wrote 6, it's a typo, of ways that cognitive biases function. So first is anchoring, which is known as the tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information offered or the anchor when making decisions, right? I think many of us have either seen or have been enthralled in various conversations about what took place at the Oscars just a few nights ago. If you haven't, you can Google it and you will find all the information is that you need. But in thinking about that particular incident, right, the headlines, as we often call them, right, both in higher education and popular culture, often serve as the anchor from which we make all other decisions, right? We sort of are assuming, right, and intuitively thinking through what the other additional details instead of asking questions, which is really important in thinking about addressing issues of anchoring bias. 2, confirmation bias, which is perhaps the most popular, right, especially as we're thinking about looking for evidence with regards to support for our claims. It's the tendency to favor information that confirms the things that we already believe, or hypotheses that we may already have. Right. So if we're sort of preconditioned to believe certain things about individual groups of people, we are readily sure to believe things that confirm that perspective or opinion, opposed to looking for what we would say in the research community as negative cases, right? Things that are disconfirming, that challenge that set of beliefs and assumptions. There's also distinction bias, the tendency to view 2 opinions as more distinctive when evaluating them side by side or simultaneously than when evaluating them separately, right? And we see this even in like the sort of general day space of being a consumer. Right? If you walk into a department store and you go into the electronics display and you see 5, 7, 10 TVs that are on the wall, all displaying the same picture, right? We are hypercritical of which picture might actually be the best based on which TV is that we're seeing, even though all the pictures are probably very, very clear. And we only notice those specific differences when we're actually looking at them side by side. And the same thing can happen when we're trying to create an understanding of distinction between individuals and also the work that they produce. Mere exposure effect is known as the tendency to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar or recognizable. This works in tandem with confirmation bias, right? If we see or expect of a student who we perceive to be studious based on their performance of this role of student in the classroom, opposed to that student who perhaps is reluctant to participate because they're the only student of color perhaps in the class, right? That particular exposure effect would reinforce this idea that, well, we're familiar with what are considered strong habits, right, for students who are going to perform well versus students that are not performing well, and often will evaluate them as such as a result. There's also negativity bias, the tendency to have a greater recall of or focus on the unpleasant or negative memories compared with positive memories, right? So part of this is informed by what we consider maybe the preponderance of evidence that would suggest the things that we have been told, the stereotypes, the myths about other folks are things that are actually true, perhaps based on a singular, perhaps negative experience with that individual group, or the secondhand or vicarious sets of experiences as those who often tell negative experiences to us, even if we have not had them ourselves. And 6th and finally, an adjacent relation point to bias, stereotyping, a prejudicial reflection, which is generally negative, of expectations and beliefs about the general characteristics of subordinated social groups and their members as perceived differently from dominant social groups, especially as our own. Now, to be sure, stereotyping isn't something that is relegated to either being a part of a dominant or non-dominant group. In fact, many of us internalize, right, and harbor these same types of stereotypes about folks that look like us, right? And all of this being a primary function of white supremacy, at least in the racial context. But this is, I think, a critical understanding, right, is like how stereotypes manifest and how not only we are treated by others, but also how we treat each other as members of this insular community, right? Again, going back to the Oscar example, that there was a lot of internal conversation about the extent to which the exchange that happened between Will Smith and Chris Rock actually should have taken place in front of a predominantly white audience, right? That it might reinforce a particular version or a stereotype about Black men as fundamentally aggressive, opposed to maybe focusing on the issue of men challenging other men when they engage in misogynistic acts towards Black women, right? So all of these are things that we have to wrestle with in these entanglements of our own sort of practices of teaching and learning, but things that manifest in college university life relatively commonly, right? And things that have to be recognized and checked. So what are some questions that we might consider? Well, first, what types of cognitive bias have you yourself experienced in your institutional role as a student, staff, faculty, or administrator? How has that particular bias manifested in your work? Again, thinking about those 6 points of cognitive bias. 2, how have you experienced bias in your everyday life outside of the university? One thing we know to be sure is that the microaggressions and things that are experienced inside of the college and university context, in many ways, simply mirror those that are experienced outside of the college and university space, which means to say that if these biases remain unchecked in our personal lives, they surely will manifest themselves in our professional lives, again, with longstanding, perhaps lifelong consequences. And 3, what have been your challenges in confronting and overcoming how bias manifests in your personal life? All right, so just stopping the share here for a moment. I'd like for us to engage around these questions, which I'm going to add to the chat. That way folks will have them readily and available. Given our breakout rooms, we're just gonna take a few moments in breakout rooms for us to engage around these questions. And so we'll try to limit the number of folks to about 7 or 8, but we'll take, I would say, give or take 7 or so minutes to just engage around these questions in no particular order, just those that speak to us, so we can have a little bit more engaged discussion amongst those that are participating today. All right, if you're not in a room, you should be moved to one shortly, or you should have a link that allows you to click and be added to a room. All right, welcome back. Just wait for all of our folks to get back in. All right, I think all of our folks have returned from our breakout rooms. I do hope that it was generative in terms of discussion, which again, we can engage more around some of the things that came out of that during our Q&A. For the sake of time, we'll continue to press forward. So in thinking about bias, one of the things that's really important for us to collectively understand, and I'm sure many already do, right, is that often bias gets sort of obscured, right, because it's approximation with other ways that bias manifests. And so I always think that it's important to think about these things across sort of not necessarily like a hierarchy, right, but levels at which these things function. And so thinking about this in relation to, again, things that have often become approximate is differentiating bias, prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. And so bias, as we talked about, were implicit mental associations. Prejudice usually rises from those implicit mental associations to often unsubstantiated meanings associated with the implicit associations that inform both implicit and explicit beliefs that are typically used to generalize a predetermined understanding about individuals or groups. Thirdly, discrimination are the enactments of prejudice informed by bias, either by individuals or collective groups, into actions that disenfranchise and exclude individuals and groups from access to equal opportunities and equitable outcomes. Fourth, and perhaps most notably, oppression, right? Again, building on the 3 sort of preceding aspects, that oppression really provides with a systemic analysis, one that understands that these are systemic or institutional manifestations of prejudicial discrimination, right? The isms we constantly refer to, racism, sexism, homophobia, which may supersede the sustaining actions of individuals and include the societal and cultural norms, resulting in the widespread unjust treatment of individuals and communities through processes of minoritization and marginalization. And so part of this is to call attention to the dynamics between systems and individuals, and that in fact, in many regards, despite some individual actions, that these systems largely still persist, right? And so we cannot reduce this notion of oppression to a set of interpersonal interactions, but instead have to have a different understanding, which we'll talk about a bit when we get into the piece about microaggressions, that there is a systemic sort of process that has to be accounted for. And so what do we do when we're trying to address these notions of implicit bias? Of course, we've understood and identified them in name, but what does that actually look like? Well, thinking about that and the consequences, how we might mitigate that, I sort of recommend a 3-prong approach. First, starting with recognition, then remediation, and lastly, rehearsal. And so recognition first requires that we acknowledge rather than dismiss biases as they arise, right? The common sort of thing is if we sort of ignore these issues or we ignore these biases as they prop up, they somehow will like go away. But in fact, we actually have to confront those through the process of asking critical questions about our decision making. What is informing those decisions, and how we're coming about those decisions in the first place, right? This could be from everything in terms of hiring practices with regard to faculty and staff, how we're evaluating students who we consider to be a part of a college and university community. And so it's not that we won't have these thoughts, again, based on preconditions, based on socialization, based on engaging with media and other types of information, but we have to acknowledge them first, right? If we're going to actually engage in some level of repair to address those. Now, remediation demands a commitment to professional learning about implicit biases, some of which we are covering today, but also not thinking of them just in a general sense, right? Thinking about them in an individual and personal sense of how biases manifest in our lives, which is part of what we were trying to accomplish with some of that initial questioning. And then also repeatedly engaging with new experiences and information to develop different cognitive associations, right? And so part of this means that we have to broaden our sphere of influence, broaden our social circle, but also broaden what it is that we ourselves are learning. I think this is especially important for faculty, right? Many of us are trained and have deep expertise in a very particular content area, but that doesn't always mean that we fully understand how these things function or operate, especially if we're in a domain or a field or a discipline that doesn't consider itself these issues germane to that particular study. We often see that in conversations around STEM, for example, STEM disciplines. But part of this means that if we broaden our understanding, right, through actually looking intentionally for the contributions of a diverse repertoire of scholars that just doesn't include the perspectives of white scholars, right, that is an intentional effort to create a new association with how we think about who produces knowledge and who consumes knowledge. And these are all really important to, again, developing our brains in ways that create different sets of associations that challenge what we have sort of been ingrained with. And then third, the rehearsal requires an active practice of consistently confronting and challenging biases and their various manifestations as they arise both in the personal and in professional settings. And so part of this is the practice, right? If we're not sort of rehearsing and engaging in that practice, especially when it's perhaps lower stakes and less consequential, it is very unlikely that we'll be able to do so in deeply consequential moments when that's determining, again, who we may actually be hiring after a series of faculty talks have happened, what we should do in an instance where there may be some level of what we consider perhaps academic misconduct, and whether we feel like students should or should not be punitively punished rather than giving them opportunities for second chances, as I mentioned in the earlier part of the talk. So to transition us into this idea of microaggressions and thinking about microaggressions both as prejudicial and discriminatory, depending on the specific microaggression in question. Microaggressions sort of first emerged from a psychiatrist in the 1970s, Chester Pierce, who has written perhaps widely on the subject, but thinking about them that in and of themselves, that microaggressions may seem harmless, right? When we think about the sort of level at which these things actually take place, but the cumulative burden of a lifetime of microaggressions can theoretically contribute to diminished mortality, augmented morbidity, and flattened confidence. And so this is critical both in terms of how we understand that in the broader social world, but especially how we understand what it means to sort of have to wrestle with the notion of premature death in a college university context if I'm a student, right, which may think about departure, right, dropout, inability to gain access or reentry after those things take place, especially with it relates to confidence, some of which we'll talk about in a second. Now, there are three particular types of microaggressions that find themselves in the literature. Daryl Wang Su and colleagues have talked about this rather extensively in their work. And we know them to be micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. Now, micro insults include nonverbal and verbal messages that demean minoritized populations. Now, this might be something that's a bit more familiar given the sort of recent closure of the Trump administration and the level of presidential rhetoric that also found itself being manifested on campus, a lot in the conversation around undocumented students, which we know to be true for certain in California, right? These sort of messages that suggest that students don't belong simply because of their citizenship status, although we do not apply generally that same type of logic to international students for whom we are charging exorbitant amounts of tuition as ways of generating revenue. Microassaults are nonverbal and verbal, explicit and derogatory racial attacks or discrimination against minoritized populations. And third, microinvalidations being nonverbal or verbal ways to erase or diminish a person of color's lived experience and thought, right? And this is often when we see perhaps juxtapositions in college university classrooms of what perhaps the evidence that has been presented suggests versus anecdotes that are coming from the lived experiences of students about whom that evidence is often referring, right? And we can think about that with the various levels of statistical data that recognizes at least that there is a level of underachievement by students of color, broadly speaking, and yet says very little about why underachievement is made possible because of how teaching practices are often exclusionary. And so when we think about this in the context of what we do in our classrooms, it's important that we not allow for what we consider to be empirical evidence to refute the everyday lived experiences of folks who actually themselves are experts of their own experience, right? That speak back against the data that often says things are problems of their own doing. And so we can't talk about microaggressions without first thinking about this in the context of defining what it means to consider and understand race and racism, because much of what we talk about in the context of microaggressions is those that are racial. Of course, there are also gender, able, and other microaggressions that take place. In the context of race and racism, we know that history teaches us that race itself is a socially constructed category. And so although race itself may not be real as far as social scientists would be concerned, certainly the effects of racism themselves are real, right? And that this social construct was created to differentiate racial groups and to show the superiority or dominance of one race, in particular whites, over others. And this comes out of Daniel Solorzano's work, some of whom which you may be familiar as a scholar at UCLA, and really generate around the notion of how race and racism manifest in the college university context vis-a-vis campus racial climate. And so looking at racism, Solorzano pulls on two primary definitions from both Audre Lorde and Manning Marable, one of which that recognizes that racism is the belief in an inherent superiority of one race over all others, and thereby a right to dominance. Also, that a system of ignorance, exploitation, and power is used to oppress African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Pacific Americans, or Pacific Islanders, as we may call them more contemporarily, Native and Indigenous folks, and other people on the basis of ethnicity, culture, mannerisms, and color. And so these distinctions are critically important, and one that we want to recognize that racism functions in many ways well beyond the black-white binary, right? Perhaps in California also beyond the Hispanic white or Chicano white binary as well, that it's complicated for folks that are identified to be non-white in part because race has been organized through this notion of hegemonic whiteness or the superiority of those who believe themselves to be white as a dominant class group of people. But this extends even further when we look at Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work, who recognizes racism fundamentally as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So what does that mean, in sort of more commonplace? That essentially, because of this racial categorization, because of how racism functions, that it renders some of us more marginal and likely to various forms of premature death, whether that be mass incarceration, whether that be underemployment and undereducation, to various versions of premature death in academic and in social spaces. So again, wanting to think about this from a systemic analysis rather than merely interpersonal interactions. And so three large points to understand about racism. One, that it's the socially constructed belief that a racial group is inherently biologically, intellectually, or socially superior, that a group that believes itself to be superior also has the institutional power to engage in racist behaviors and sustain systemic policies and practices often devoid of accountability. And three, that the material consequences for multiple racial and ethnically minoritized people exist either individually or collectively. So what does this sort of look like if we were to map it? Well, part of it is to recognize that there is a various sort of continuum on which we sort of see and understand and experience racism that's sort of couched in two sort of ways. Active racism, which is considered socially unacceptable, and passive racism that is socially unacceptable. So we're thinking about active racism of things that are perhaps above the line, things that are passive, right, which microaggressions would be a part, things that are socially acceptable below the line. So we have things sort of that are, at the highest point, like hate crimes as they may be legally defined. And we can talk all the ways in which variety of hate crimes that do happen or violences that do happen that themselves are already codified in legal doctrine. And often, again, are devoid of accountability. We can think about particular uses of racial epithets, which has become a critical part of sort of broad level conversation now. We can think about the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups, also public racist jokes, right? The things that have often been said in the quiet that are being said out loud, the institution of slavery. But all the things below the line are things that we have relatively become accustomed to, again, thinking about that normalization, that everydayness of racism. And so what does it mean for us as educators to think that we need not divide this notion of acceptable or active versus passive racism, and really think about how that line itself is often moving as part of a temporal element, right? That as times change, as contexts change, things that are considered passive or active, right, also change, right? And I think that critical distinction is important, is that the bar for us as educators, if we are really trying to engender a community, a comfort, a sense of safety within our classrooms and on our campuses, that the line for tolerance has to be on the floor, right? That we cannot accept any of these particular behaviors. And this is critically important as we think about some of the more outrageous, perhaps more egregious, overt actions that we've seen over the last decade, right? If I were to poll this particular room and say, who amongst us was outraged at what took place in Charlottesville, right? I'm pretty sure everyone would raise their hand. But if I were to ask who was also outraged by the types of education that Richard Spencer, himself a two-time graduate of the University of Virginia, received that led him to become the person that he is, we're also outraged, I'm not sure that we would have the same level of hands. And part of that is this recognition of what we consider socially or acceptably passive, again, based on geographic context, institutional location, and things of that nature. So some questions for us to consider at this moment. What are the pedagogically unacceptable ways racism manifests in college and university classrooms? What are the pedagogically acceptable ways racism manifests in college and university classrooms, right? Again, sort of that duality. What are the socially unacceptable ways that racism manifests in the racially minoritized college students' lives? And what are the socially acceptable ways that racism manifests in racially minoritized college student lives?
All right, Dr. Davis, thank you so much. That was very powerful and so much needed. I needed to hear that. It was a great reminder. I know you all are wanting to go into different, discussion rooms again, but we're kind of nearing have about 40 minutes or so left of the program, and we want to take this time to really answer any questions folks have. So if you have any questions, please add them in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll make sure we call on you. If not, I have plenty of questions that I've been writing down during the program. So please, if you have any questions, make sure you raise your hand or add it in the chat, and we'll make sure we elevate that to Dr. Davis. In the meantime, I will go ahead and ask the question. Dr. Davis, you talked about this idea of race being socially constructed, right? The idea that, and I've been thinking about this, right? This idea, when people talk about race is, being socially constructed, even though as a social scientist, we know race is socially constructed in that sense, but the effects still being real, right? And there's this, I've been thinking about this recently, how when we really say, well, race is socially constructed, and we leave it at that, it's hard for me to not to really compare it to the idea of color blindness and say that people saying like, oh, I don't see color, and leave it at that, right? But when it comes to race, similar to that, folks saying, well, race is socially constructed, so leave it alone. It's just that. So can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point, and often a refutation that we hear, right, is like, oh, because it's socially constructed, it's not real. And I think one of the things that we miss about the idea of social constructionism generally, right, is that in order for a thing to be socially constructed, there has to be like a shared commitment to understanding it as it exists or how we've designed it, right? And so in some ways, we could actually say that race is very real, right? Like we've sort of all agreed to the designations that we have been prescribed, but more importantly, those, again, who believe themselves to be white or to be in proximity of whiteness, we can think about colorism in some regards, right, in this way, is that there's some sort of like shared social acceptance and understanding that this is how things are, right? And so I think with that's a very real action, right? Like it's both a thing that we choose and a thing that we might often refute. And for me, when I think about this notion of color blindness, which has kind of been moved, from a discourse standpoint to the notion of color evasiveness, right? The ways that we sort of like evade and obscure or even make these decisions of what we choose and don't choose. We often forget that there are so many proxies for race, right? We can look at various studies that say, okay, if your resume is going to go for a review, it's better that it be blind review, right? And what we mean by that is that there's no identifying information or things that would signal, right, how someone maybe presents with regard to their racial identity or cultural root. And part of what has been found in that, right, is that for names that present themselves to be more European, right, like I've got 2 middle initials and a suffix. And so if you just don't know maybe who I am, there's a good possibility that you would assume, right, that like I'm well educated, perhaps I'm even white, I come from a particular class background that would suggest that these designations are important, opposed to someone who has a very different name, right? And when I think about that notion of not wanting to see color, part of it is this, sort of exercise of erasure, right? To say that we don't want to see and understand the values of your lived experiences, what you've brought to the table, and how those not necessarily just being definitive, but actually shape your ability to be qualified and competent in the roles that you choose. And I think that that's really, really important in this particular moment, given what we understand, right? If we go back to to the literature on microaggressions, is one of the consequences of microaggressions is that it forces us to create a variety of counter spaces, be them academic and or social, which means for our very survival in our institutions, right, we have to have like the Black Student Study Group that's coming out of the Black Student Union or the Cultural Center, right? We have to have like faculty of color group meetings that are often meetings both before and after the main meeting that we have to have. And there's so much additional labor and taxation associated with the necessity of having to create counter spaces simply for our sort of survival in these particular spaces and places. And so again, thinking about that in the context of, color blindness, the ability to even present a position of color blindness or color evasiveness is to know that color, sort of thinking about that in the context of as a proxy for race, right, is a thing that one doesn't have to think about, right? There's a sort of privilege associated with saying, I don't think about race, because those of us who are racially minoritized have to think about race every day, right? Every time I leave my house and I'm driving to campus, right, and I see a police officer because I live right near a police station, right, I have to think about what that means if they pull out behind me because they think I'm not supposed to be driving the car that I'm driving, right? That I have to produce two IDs, my driver's license and my University of Michigan faculty ID, so that they can perceive and understand me to be something other than what it is, that their implicit biases, right, that their sort of stereotyping would understand Black men to be in this particular moment. And so I think that is like really, really important for us to sort of understand and to think about, right, is this sort of like choice and agency of who gets to decide whether race does or does not matter, right? Often it is not the people who are victims and survivors of the violence that racism occurs in our everyday life.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Dr. Davis. All right, I'm going to open it up to folks. Before we ask a question, we have a hand. Dominique, go for it.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Davis, for your presentation. Kind of going back to just some contemporary examples that we're seeing in the news, the latest being the case of, just using as a case study, of Will Smith and Chris Rock incident. I just think that's a fitting example. There perhaps is like a lot of microaggressions that we can just examine from that interaction, whether it's microassault, a number of different microaggressions that were shown. And so that got me to thinking like how insidious microaggressions can really become in a very under the surface way that we can't see, and we don't see the impact that it has on individuals until it's on full display. So in the case, using the case study of Will Smith and Chris Rock, Will Smith being the one who has the microaggressions happening to him or against his family, how is it that as educators, what are practical ways we can make sure that we're protecting our students and individuals within the campus from outbursts that could happen? So kind of a preventative type of look. How do we create safe spaces and how do we check in ways that creates a culture where that isn't the norm and that can inflict, I guess, harm on others?
Yeah, really, really great question, Dominique. Thank you for asking it. So I think part of this for me, especially in like the classroom context, right? And I could speak about this in other contexts in the university as well, but I don't think we often do the necessary relational work, right, to create the conditions for harm to occur and to be repaired, right? And what I mean by that is pretty much in every classroom at this juncture, right, the things that are happening, and this is not, I think, even as a temporal phenomenon, things that happen in the real world traverse the boundaries of campus because they come in with the students, right? So when the students leave our classrooms or they leave campus, they experience the world, or even when they're on campus, given the advent of their access to digital and social media. And so the things that are happening in the temporary world are things that are already coming into classrooms. And if they're not being discussed in the class, they're probably being discussed in a group chat, right? Or a Signal or some other channel that students are still engaging around these ideas that are often outside of the purview of the professor. But students come in with that. And I think when it's especially heavy, given the sort of visualizations of police and state-sanctioned violence, for example, or any, hearing more and more news about trans women of color and Black trans women specifically being killed, that these are things that we hope that we don't have to confront in our classroom, just students are having to confront them on a day-to-day basis. And they often present as a barrier to our ability to engage in the teaching and learning that we have planned for that day. Now, I don't suggest that every faculty member attempt to try to go into that conversation, right, without the necessary tools to be able to facilitate that in a meaningful way. But one thing that's really important is that if we have not yet created a container for the conversation, right, something that can hold the gravity of the things that we want to discuss, which is really built on a relationship of trust between the instructor and the students, but also within the student group, then it's going to be really hard to have that conversation. And so part of our ability to manage and deal with microaggressions in the classroom is whether we actually have a container that says accountability looks like X, right? And not one that is simply reporting something to code of conduct that ultimately lead to some sort of punitive sanction, perhaps involving police, right? But that we have to accept as a precondition of teaching and learning as a process that harm is likely to occur. And that when we think about classroom incivility, that the conflict again could happen between instructor and student, between student and student, or perhaps even between instructors. And so we have to decide how are we going to deal with that when it happens. And that should be a shared determination, right? One that's guided and facilitated by the instructional leader, which is the professor at the moment, but also one that sort of convenes to the norms of the classroom in which they find themselves, right? That students actually can be part owners and really take a certain level of agency, we often don't describe them, in determining like what feels safe for you, right? And to know that just because we've established it at the beginning of the semester doesn't mean it won't have to be reestablished as an ongoing effort throughout the semester, so that every time we come to these impasses, right, we feel more comfortable about engaging in that conversation. I think the second point of that is faculty have to demonstrate, and instructors generally have to demonstrate a certain level of moral courage to engage with students who have decided or attempted, whether knowingly or unknowingly, harm upon other students in the classroom. One of the things we consistently hear when we do campus climate work is that I experienced something in the class and the professor did nothing. Now, there are a bunch of reasons for that, right? It could be sort of a level of a lack of competency around how to engage in mediating, classroom conflict. It could also be out of concern if I am a, say, Black woman faculty member in a predominantly white institution, a predominantly white classroom, right? The ways my authority and content subject matter expertise has already been challenged, that my intervention in this moment might sort of leave me open to further subjugation by white students who evaluate me poorly, right? That then is also going to be reported to a larger white institutional apparatus vis-a-vis the department chair, the dean, and or some larger institutional administration that also will not believe sort of my position, right? And the risk for itself is not it's not worth it for me to engage in that mediation. But I think these are all important ways that we have to consider about how we create the context for our classrooms to manage and respond to conflict, right? That understandings of campus climate are rooted in how we deal and mediate conflict, and then being really committed to resolution through forms of restoration and repair that can actually happen between the person who is perpetuating the harm and the person who experienced harm in ways that do not require us to involve various parts of the carceral university system.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Dr. Davis. And thank you for the question, Dominique. Any other questions before we go to our next question? Monica, go for it.
Oh, sorry. I just kind of had a quick question. Kind of like on the guidelines that you were talking about that need to be set. Would you say that by setting such guidelines, you'd also be taking into account the mental health of minoritized individuals, mental health of minoritized individuals, such as generational traumas sustained from generation to another generation, that would be empathetic to their mental health as well? Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I think one of these things that we see often, right, is okay, the college university is a setting in which we should be engaged in the democratic debate of ideas, right? This is kind of what it's reduced to. And part of the missing piece of this always, and this is largely in the discourses around academic freedom, is there's no analysis of power, right? And so when I think about what that means in my classroom, it's although one of our sort of courageous, our agreements for courageous conversations, which emerged out of Singleton and Linton's work in the K-12 context, is to speak your truth, right? It's to understand that although you are entitled to speak your truth, that does not limit you from the repercussions of that truth, right? But secondly, that we cannot hold an equitable amount of space if we're trying to hold equal space. And part of what I mean by that is if what is being shared is advancing the perspective of the status quo, right? And so if we want to talk about, we've used this sort of case example, we'll take an issue, let's take an incident of campus racism, right? Something happens on your campus, which I know to be true, some things have happened at CSUN over the last few years, and we want to talk about it in class. Well, surely we need to create and hold more space for those who have been deeply affected and impacted by not just what took place, but the historical trauma of things that have consistently taken place against their communities, right? We can't say that we're like, oh, well, both white students and students of color will need to speak, which is true, yes, but we can't provide a disproportionate amount of airtime or let go unchallenged white supremacist notions that may be advocated for on behalf of that group without allowing for those who have traditionally been disenfranchised from having their voices heard to take up the main stage in this space. And that, I think, is especially true of the certain types of classes that I teach. But I think in any sort of situation, right, we have to recognize that, okay, what's being said, and this is sort of a thinking on our feet exercise, right? Well, what's being said is telling us the thing that we already know to be true, right? It's reinforcing an idea that these particular folks deserve the things that they're experiencing. It's based on individual bad decisions opposed to systemic realities, and actually confront and challenge that and provide the space, right? Part of our ability as instructors is to take space and make space, right? We're already deferred to as the authority figures in the particular learning environment. So what does it mean to intercede and say, okay, based on what it is that we've heard, we need to hear from other voices who actually can provide a counter narrative, right? Something that resists the master narratives of not just higher education, but of the world itself. And I think that's just a really important part, right? Because if we just hold these things to be equal, those who are speaking the voice of power will always be the loudest. And this is true of those who are invited to campus that remain unchallenged, right? Any number of what we call controversial speakers, right? That are never sort of, they're giving nothing but a platform to spew things that are hateful and hurtful to the campus climate and then leave. And then the students who have attempted to protect themselves, right? Protect their dignitary safety are the ones who are facing the consequences and brunt of student conduct policies. So I think all of those things have to be taken into account to ensure that equity as terms of outcome is the thing that we're seeking, not equality of platform.
Thank you.
I see Dina has a question here. On the topic of issues of today, what sort of biases can we observe surrounding the world's response to the occupation of Ukraine as opposed to other ongoing occupations or wars happening around the world? I mean, Dina, this is the question, right? It's been the question for several weeks, so I appreciate you raising it. And I think one thing we know to be true, right, is that at least in the United States, we seem to be critical of all empires except our own, right? Or the way that our empire has fundamentally functioned to unseat and unsettle the democratic rights of those who live in other places around the world. More importantly, what we see and when it takes place in the context of Europe or Eastern Europe, right, that often the world has a different type of outrage or a selective outrage, right? And I think part of that is about one's proximity to whiteness as a racial category, even if ethnically, right, a part of a different set of groups, right? If you think about the many and varied ethnic groups that make up Ukraine, that renders their suffering, right, as something that we should not stand for. And we saw this partly in the comments, or really in the large comments around the news media that says, oh, you would expect this to happen in Syria, right? You would expect this to happen in X, Y, and Z black or brown country, but it should not happen in a place like Ukraine that is perceived to be civilized by Western standards. And I think that for me and for many of us is a way that we see the notions of bias, right, that are coming up. And part of that is this sort of like bias to think of human atrocity or humanity itself to be something that's only accessible, right, to people who believe themselves to be white or white, you know, in terms of proximity, right? And I think that for me and for all of us, right, sort of begs the question of like, well, if this is what you think humans are and these people have access to humanity, then what does that mean for myself, right? And if we can't actually confront that reality and also the ways in which, again, the United States consistently, both historically and contemporarily, props up regimes that further its national interests at the expense of the people who are there, even to the benefit of those themselves who are black and brown, imperialists and fascists, right, who are in the pockets of these sort of imperial entities. Sort of losing my train of thought here, but I mean, I think we kind of like get the gist essentially, right? Like that these are just the ways that bias in the media itself presents and how our inability to check our own biases, right, would then go with the media narrative that this is a human atrocity, which it is, right, that we should call and name, but we cannot do so at the expense of not also then naming the atrocities that are happening at the expense of the United States and its allies, right? And I think that is sort of the critical sort of piece that's often missing in this conversation of not that what's happening in Ukraine shouldn't be focused on, but that it shouldn't be the only thing that we focus on, right? And I think the last point sort of tie this all in, right, is this sort of outrage to the type of violence or imperialistic violence that's happening at this particular moment, you know, at the hands of what's considered an adversary to the American empire, right? That so many various versions of that violence consistently takes place. And we saw this even in the iterations of World War II, right? Although there was a deep sort of concern, as there should have been, for the Holocaust and what's happening to Jewish people inside of Europe, that the Nazis themselves knew that racial discrimination and prejudice and anti-Blackness was so deeply seated in the United States, they would broadcast messages to Black soldiers on the front lines, right, to let them know that their country did not care about them, that they were fighting a war, in fact, that they still had to fight when they returned back home. And so this is part of that discontinuity, right, that we cannot be sort of selectively outraged about these things, that if we fundamentally understand and believe us all to be human beings, then we, again, are entitled to all of those same things, those inalienable rights. And we have to be at least as critical as we are of other places as we are about our place that we consider home.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Great question too, Dina. Before we move on to our question, any other questions for anyone else? Great. Dwayne has a question.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Davis, for the great introduction, and then also the workshop as well. Really insanely informative. I guess something that kind of stuck with me in the beginning is that you were talking about how we see student activists constantly changing and evolving over the years, and how the torch is essentially passed on to the next generation to see active change. As a student activist myself, I oftentimes find myself feeling burnt out and really discouraged in a lot of ways due to the perceived lack of change that I personally feel is happening on my campus. So I guess my question would be, what would you say to a student like that that's struggling with trying to comprehend the baton passing, in a sense, of generations, to see how far we've actually come?
Yeah, great question, Dwayne. So I think part of it is understanding that we are all but a marker on the long historical timeline of organized resistance, right? And then this is how Black Lives Matter sort of thinks about itself in relation to all the various struggles that have happened, everything from, the very first abolitionist movement that was organized itself by enslaved persons to the civil rights movements to where we find ourselves today. And so in thinking about that, right, we understand that this is a struggle that not only has happened before, but will continue. And so part of us is sort of just accepting that as a sense of sort of lifelong work, right? And Ella Baker would sort of challenge us to think that like every day of every week of every month of every year is a time in which we should be fighting. Because as much as we are fighting the things as they exist in today's terms, right, these things are consistently changing. This is why we're fighting against racism even now, even though we've had the abolition of slavery, even though we've had integration, even though we've had these various milestones that suggest some level of racial progress, which actually to me is a progress at best of white folks and white supremacy in and of itself, right? Which through Derek Bell's work on interest convergence says that those benefits have only come to the extent that the state sort of generally or white institutions themselves have also benefited. So I think if we understand that, then it becomes less daunting, right? That we're not able to accomplish all the things that we want to accomplish in a given campaign or given our particular tenure on a university campus, but also understanding that college and university administrators routinely use as a strategy, right, to disempower student activists, the power of waiting it out, right? They understand, as all of us did as student activists, right, that our mommies and daddies didn't send us up here to just be activists. They send us up here to graduate, which means we got to get out of this place. And so in many ways, there's a strategic effort to stall in terms of responsiveness, right, to stall in terms of meeting with students, and to stall in terms of delivering on the things that they're asking for, in part because they know that students will have to leave. So I think one, understanding those two realities really makes more livable and understandable how it is that we engage in this practice. I think thirdly, we have to be committed to building our capacity across the campus with folks who are going to be here longer than we will be able to be there. And so a lot of what we'll see is, student activists who get involved as freshmen, sophomores, some of which who are retained and stay and engage in leadership, but there often isn't necessarily a backfilling of those students to be, informed and aware of the things that have happened before and transmitting that information. Similarly, we aren't always sure of student activists who come before us and the people we need to engage with and reach out to who may be demobilized now, but have a lot of institutional knowledge of things that have happened. And what we've seen in the study of student activism recently is that for many student activists, it wasn't until they spoke to those who had been there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, who understood that the things that they're actually asking for are things that were already asked for. And here are the ways that they sort of were navigated in terms of the institution. So as an example, we can think about race and ethnic studies, which of course is a big conversation and always has been in California, but that for some places that institutionalization has only come in the form of programs and not in forms of departments, which means they don't have the dedicated faculty or resources needed to support the students who want to engage in that. Some of those programs are actually closed down around the country. And again, that being a manifestation of student activism themselves that said this needs to be on our campus. But in thinking about that, right, one of the things that might be learned is that, oh, we need to be fighting for departmentalization, not just for programmatic existence as a program, because we won't have the things that we need. The same thing could be said for the advocacy for chief diversity officers or diversity offices that don't always have the budgets or the executive power to make determinations that otherwise is consistent with other executive stations on the campus. So I think all of those things could be helpful. And then the last thing, and probably the most important thing, is that we have to hold space and find ways to engage in joy and life making that isn't just about struggle, right? And I think that has to be an active decision, because struggle is always present, strain is always present. And so if we don't choose these moments away in order to engage in life making that actually fulfills us, that actually restores us and makes us whole, right? And then we always feel experiences of fatigue. And eventually we're going to burn out, right? Whether that's through racial fatigue or activist burnout, as is discussed in the literature. And I think all those things together might make a way for a sense of activist life making, one that's committed to what I would call a recalcitrant disposition for authority, one that's livable and sustainable in the long haul.
Thank you for that, Dr. Davis.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question, Dwayne, and thank you, Dr. Davis. Megan?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, what do you do when you realize that you've always had a passion for advocacy, but it starts to turn to almost anger when you're starting to see, I'm a lot older than most of my cohort, most of my classmates, and you're starting to see something turn back. Like, I can remember when things were a certain way that I don't want to see it go back to. I can see something go back to where friends that are in the LGBTQ community, I don't want to see my friends have to live through that where we lived through it before. And what happened with Trump, and people call me and tell me stories that I remember all too well. And, I'm getting angry about things that I remember living through before, and I don't want to see these things repeated. Like, I know that these things we didn't come as far as some people thought we had, but I know that we had come a little bit further. And I realized that a lot of things were allowed to be kicked back into the light, that, rocks were picked up and they were allowed to be back out in the open. And so a lot of my passion is turning to anger, and I don't want that to happen because I won't be heard. And how do I reel that back in?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So if I can sort of deconstruct it a little bit, I want to start by saying that I think rage is actually a very useful and productive motivator and a way of distilling discipline in the long fight, right? I think the challenge, right, is that we ultimately get consumed by that rage, right, in ways that actually affect our well-being, which kind of goes back to my earlier point of like, where do we choose, right, to experience joy? Because if we don't choose it, right, inevitably the way the world is, it will eat us alive. And we know that. We've experienced that. We sort of drudge into despair. And part of understanding hope, right, is not that it's an ideal, but in fact, it's a discipline. It's the thing that we have to practice. And so I think part of countering, right, those feelings of rage and moment is to really be in community. Part of that is an affront to this notion in America that we have of individualism generally and rugged individualism specifically, right, that we should go at things alone, that all of our best values demonstrated, when we can do things at an individual level. But what we know to be true, especially for those of us who resist, right, is that there's power in community, there's power in people, right? Our self-determination is ultimately determined by the community that we exist in. And so I think when we take it that way and we share in community this similar sense of rage, which fundamentally is about disappointment, right? It's about hurt, that we are the only folks who can keep us safe. And I think that's the thing that we've understood historically, right? That these institutions are not here to protect us, right? The police are not here to protect us, that we're the only things that keep us safe. We're the only things that make us whole, because we've seen that these institutions time and time again, right, over long and short histories, will always choose violence, right? They will wake up and choose violence, right? As we say, sort of in like the commonplace. And so I think in all of that, right, not being consumed by the rage will be really important, but like we have to have that rage, that sort of righteous indignation, in these moments, because if we're not, like, if you're not outraged, right, we're not listening, we're not paying attention. And that's where I get concerned, where I feel like a lot of us have been forced into a certain nihilism, right? And Cornel West talks about this in terms of race, but this exists across difference too. A sense of like, well, what does it even matter that I'm engaged in this work? Well, what we do know is that if we don't do it, right, the line will only continue to get pushed further back, right? And if we do it, we're not really sure exactly the level of possibility that comes. And I think we have to take that long view, right? If we think about this in the more popular sort of moment, we can think about the conversation around policing and police abolition, right? Defund the police wasn't even part of a like generic central political conversation 2 or 3 years ago. But as a result of organizers and activists who have made consistent sort of demands, but also a clear blueprint of why if we divest from the institution of policing and we invest in community resources and supports, we will actually have stronger communities that don't need police, right? That was only made possible by folks who consistently pushed for the agenda item to where it's now been debated at various levels, right? Local, state, and federal, to the point where some movement is actually being made. And some of those progresses will happen. But again, we're all fighting for a world in which we can be free, but one that we may not live long enough to experience and exist in. And that's part of the ability for us to engage in these freedoms today, as somebody fought that didn't have that opportunity and that choice. So we have to sort of accept that. And then lastly, a thing that's pointed to, and Robin D.G. Kelly and a number of others talk about this work as well. When we think about coalition, when we think about community, right, we have to know that it is not sort of a me versus we, but an us versus them sort of dynamic, right? And that if we all sort of agree upon the things that are doing us harm, which is why naming is so important, right? When we think about those who were fighting, sort of in abolitionism, the greatest threat that abolitionism posed was not just the emancipation of those who were enslaved, but that those who were also in various forms of enslavement, we think about racial capitalism in Europe and otherwise, right? White farm workers and working class folks who are working with sharecroppers, right? Sort of post-emancipation, that was the fundamental threat that the state was really worried about. And so when we find community in others, we find community in those who perhaps have different and similar experience, but we agree that what is happening to me not only should just not happen to me, but it should not happen to any of us, then I think we create more of a space for us to be able to have that rage and it not, again, consume us in everything that we're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. And thank you, Megan, for that question. I know we have about 3 minutes to before we end the program. And we have had great questions since come in the chat. I know if you can maybe take a minute or so just to briefly, there's one about different forms of discrimination, the idea that ableism and the way one looks also, used as a form of discrimination. And then another question on how, folks who say they're not racist, because they're not racist, hands up, that's it, kind of this idea of not being concerned about educating oneself on race or racism or Black history because one claims that they're not racist. So just if you can quickly touch on those two, and then we'll make sure, to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you for that summary and Lionel for the question. So I think part of this is a recognition that it's not an either or conversation, right? That in fact, when we think about it through the intersectional lens, we think about Kimberly Crenshaw's work that recognizes not just this notion of intersecting identities, right? But that there are intersecting systems of oppression for those who live at those intersections, right? That render them more marginal than others, is that something like ableism or lookism is not a thing that has to be talked to necessarily like separate from race, right? That they're actually folks themselves, many of whom are in this room even, who are both people of color and live with the disability, right? Using and referring to that example that we refer to with the Oscars, right? That part of like what was being lodged at that particular moment was not just a form of misogyny, right? Or specific sexism against Black women, but also a deep form of ableism, given that alopecia itself, right, is an autoimmune disease that renders folks in very different ways limited with regard to ability. So I think part of it is to know that those are like concentric circles, right, that overlap. But that even within that, part of this is what we're wrestling with, even in spaces where we're trying to create levels of racial solidarity or gender solidarity, is that these are the disruptions within the disruption, right? And part of what I argue often is that for any groups that are attempting to develop any level of racial solidarity internally, we have to confront things like ableism and homophobia and sexism if we're actually going to have a strong level of racial solidarity, because if not, it undermines our ability to be in right relationship with one another, right? And so if we are not fighting for Black disabled folks, right, then Black lives aren't actually all mattering simultaneously, right? Only certain lives that have been privileged to be able-bodied, right, or to have a particular aesthetic are the ones that are valued. And I think that's just an important recognition as we think about. I agree that these are things that have been moved closer from center than they are from margin, but things that are still not widely understood, in part because of how they manifest and perhaps some of the subtle ways that we don't, given the way that many of our institutions, if not all of them, are run by folks who are perceived or understood to be able-bodied, right? That we take a compliance approach opposed to a more holistic and safe environments approach that would say that we don't need to simply just be compliant with ADA or avoid, right, ADA compliance because our buildings are old enough that they don't have to comply. But actually we should engage in and talk with students who have perhaps physical disability or impairments navigating campus of how we can make campus more accessible. So I'll leave it at that since I know we're kind of pressed for time, but thank you again for your question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. That was very thoughtful, very thorough. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions. I want to take the time to really show our gratitude to our partners from the Office of Student Success, Dr. Melanie, Helen, and Sydney, who also were partnering with us on this program. We're so grateful for our USU staff and students who are really doing the work around this and really behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Kayleen, Dwayne, Audrey Martinez, Deborah Hammond, everyone who's really who you just heard me speak most of the time, but we have so many folks behind the scenes. We're so grateful. Our leaders, both students and staff, are really doing this work. Again, this is part one of 3-part programs. Today we focus on microaggressions and implicit biases. On April 13th, we have Angela Davis joining us on what are fuels of racism. Be sure to join us on April 13th. And again, we should have another program on advocating or becoming an advocate, anti-racist advocate, really expanding on this. Dr. Davis really set the grounds for us and really opened this 3-part program that we've been really anticipating this whole semester. So we're so grateful for your time, Dr. Davis. We're so grateful for our partners. Again, be on the lookout. And our next programs, we're really partnering with, again, our Office of Student Success, our Black House, our University Counseling Services, and it's really sponsored by, as well as our Department of Africana Studies, and our program is sponsored by our Diversity and Equity Innovation Grant. So we're so grateful to be able to do great programs and really have these essential conversations. Thank you, everyone, for spending your evening with us. Have a wonderful day. We hope to see you around in other programs, and let us know. And I know a few folks reach out to me regarding the recording. The recording will be available on our university USU YouTube channel in a few weeks, so be on the lookout for that.